So with that, I'm going to introduce Dr. Holly Silvers. Holly, thanks so much. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, George. It's such an unbelievable pleasure to be part of this symposium. I live, eat, and breathe this sport. I do work with some other sports, but my conformational bias lies with soccer. So absolute pleasure to be here, and feel free to reach out to me. There's my Twitter handle. You can email me. I have my email at the end of this presentation. It's a quick presentation, a little bit dense, but next slide. But I think there's some good information we can share. Obviously, we know soccer is the most widely played sport. We have over 300 million registered players globally. What I love, I've been in this space for about 22 years now, and I love this second bullet point, where it's the second most popular sport in the United States now. When I started as my clinical career, it was about fifth. So I love to see the growth in our domestically, and love to see the growth domestically within the female cohort. We have about 1.6 million female players in the United States. And if you look at the first US female collegiate game played, which is back in 1977, since that time, there's been a 1,200% growth in the game domestically, hence our dominance. But that just is so exciting to me. And we've been the leaders, globally in that regard. Next slide. However, unfortunately, we have injuries continue to occur, and in some cases increase. Next. So how can we mitigate? We're going to talk specifically about ACL injury risk. And unfortunately, when I started my career, I worked closely with Bert Mandelbaum. There are about 100,000 ACLs that were happening annually in our nation. Unfortunately, that's doubled. Nearly doubled, if not completely doubled, in the space of 20 years. If we look at the high school data, so specific to ACL injury, girls soccer ranks #1 with the highest incidence rate of ACL injuries per athletic exposure, and boys is just behind boys football and boys lacrosse, ranked at #3. So there are about 43,000 ACL injuries that just occur in high school alone in the United States. Next slide. If we look at the ACL injury rate in the NCAA, it's kind of a pretty dim picture as well, with women exceeding that of women's rate exceeding that of her male cohort by about 3 to 6 times, depending on whether we're looking at game or training practice rates. Next. And when we look at some data, Rob Brophy, who's a colleague, works out of St. Louis, published this paper looking at what happens to these people after an ACL injury. If we follow them out within 7 years of an ACL injury, 65% of these individuals are no longer playing. Next. And this is a pretty dim statistic. If we think about female collegiate soccer players, 1 in 19 will tear her ACL. So when we think of the average roster, we're looking at 1 to 1.5 ACLs per team per season, with some teams domestically exceeding that. Very unfortunately, I've been involved with UCLA recently, and they've been averaging 6 to 7 ACL tears per season. I mean, it's astonishing. It breaks my heart, and we can do better. We have data to help eliminate or mitigate, not eliminate, but mitigate this risk. Next slide. This was a study out of UNC, and they basically tracked athletes that came into college that had already had an ACL. So in this particular cohort, they looked at 35 ACLs that had an ACL prior to matriculating at UNC, and they found that over 17% of them re-injured their ACL while they were at UNC, and 20% of them injured the opposite ACL, so the opposite side. Now, during those 4 years, there were 54 that sustained new ACLs, so did not have a high school reconstruction. This was new. And even within that short time, if you think only about a 4 to 5 year tenure, 2% of them re-injured the same one that they injured in college, and 11% of them re-injured the opposite side while in college. Next. Can we do better? Yes, we can do better, and we should do better. Next slide. So historically, like when we started in this space back in like the late 90s, early 2000s, we kind of categorized ACLs by 4 risk factors, and those included anatomy, biomechanics, environmental risk factors, so considering cleat choice in turf versus grass, and then hormonal situations, hormonal interplay, rather specifically to women with estrogen and progesterone playing a role from a joint laxity perspective. Next slide. We've expanded these categorical risk factors to include medical training resources. So specifically on the female side, what are their optimal resources available? And that doesn't mean just money, that means personnel. Do we have adequate athletic training, strength and conditioning resources available that are commensurate to what we're seeing on the men's side? And the other issue we have to now closely consider are genetics, because we have found there are some literature indications that genetics do play a role. If you have a family member who has torn an ACL, your likelihood of sustaining an injury is a little higher, but those are the people we want to pay specific attention to, because those are the people we want to get from a prevention aspect. We want to get them prospectively versus being reactive and treating them on the post-operative side. Next slide. And you could go through these, yeah, the three of them, perfect. There are 3 studies, 2 of which I've been involved with on the publication side, looking at what is actually happening when an ACL occurs. And basically the bottom line of all these biomechanical analyses of both men and women is basically you're playing a defensive role. And that doesn't mean you're a defender. That means you're reacting, right? So there's this element of the brain not being completely ready to equip your body from a movement perspective, because you're trying to predict what your opponent's doing, and it puts you in a vulnerable position. So the whole essence of prevention is basically preparation, right? Preparation for the intended outcome of the ball, of your opponent. And we don't want to set you up in a position where you have to react and all of a sudden your head and trunk are doing one thing and your leg is stuck in a position where it's dropping in, what we call dynamic valgus, where the foot may be in pronation, where you may be in a little bit of rotation. So all of our prevention efforts are predicated on the fact incorporating all of this information we have on the video analysis side, all of the other information we have on like the post-injury side, and incorporating that and rewinding, if you will, and saying, what can we do proactively, prospectively to prevent the primary injury in the first place? Next slide. This is one of our national team players. You can play the video. I hope this shows well on Zoom, but you'll see her in the center of the screen and you'll see the player in blue encroaching on her. She never makes contact with the player, but could we show the video just one more time? But she's anticipating contact. Here you'll see, again, striking the ball, encroaching. The player is anticipating contact. So you see that sort of quintessential drop in of her right limb, her kicking limb. Next slide. So we're going to break this down into parts. And I took split screen shots. Some of them are a little bit fuzzy, but basically in the preparation phase, things look good. She's in hip extension, she's abducted, the knees flexed, everything's looking good. As this player starts to encroach, then we see things start to go a little bit awry. So we see the shot taken, she's in a little bit of excessive trunk flexion, the hip is flexed, the knee starts to extend as the shot comes off. Then as the defender encroaches, you'll see her start to go into trunk rotation. So increased trunk flexion, and then she starts to move her trunk into rotation and lateral trunk flexion. And then we start to see the hip coming across her body in what we call adduction. As the defender, and again, it's hard to tell from this perspective, she does not make contact with her, but the player is anticipating contact. She's trying to get out of the way of the right foot of the encroaching player. So her hip goes into further adduction. And when she makes that step, we see then the purple circle, the reaction time, she steps down, her knee is in this drop-in position, her trunk's in rotation, she's off balance, and that's where she sustains the ACL injury. So how do we prevent that? Next slide. So there has been a litany, like a really wonderful amount of research has gone into the ACL prevention or the ACL mitigation space. I have been honored to be part of a few of them. We've helped develop the 11 Plus in the PEP program, but there has been so much work globally done in this space. And basically the essence, the message is they all work, and please use one of them. They all work to some capacity. You can choose one, you can choose another for if you want to mix up the monotony. If there's one little take home from my message tonight is please use one or many of these programs to just include into your specific club, because they really do. Like on the low end, they work for 60% injury mitigation or ACL injury prevention. On the high end, we're upwards of 88, 89%. They really do work. Basically the take home was you have to do them. It's a compliance issue. Next slide. So these were two of the studies that I was involved with back in the early 2000s. I'm absolutely dating myself at this point, but we had developed a program called the PEP program, which was an ACL specific program for females. We rolled this out in Southern California and club soccer players between the ages of 14 to 18. And we did a 2-year study, and we continued the study in the second year because, quite frankly, we were so astounded by the impact this program had that we thought this has to be a statistical blip. But sorry. So basically in year 1, we had an 88% mitigation of ACL injury. The second year we followed up, we had a 74% reduction in ACL injury. And this is just the dynamic warm-up. All this is about a 40-minute commitment per week maximum. You have to do it 2 times per week. Just plugs in, plugs out of your existing dynamic warm-up. So there's no equipment necessary, no cost associated. There's so many upsides to this. We wanted to make it as plug-in friendly, if you will, as possible. Next slide. So the following year, because of our results, we teamed up with the Centers for Disease Control with Julie Gilchrist, and basically we wanted to roll this out like, hey, can this be as influential at the Division I level? So we teamed up with the CDC, and basically, next slide, we found, yes, indeed it was. We had basically overall a 72% reduction at the D1 women's level. And what's interesting, if we look at the very top of the graph, if you look at history of ACL, so those are the individuals we talked about earlier, the UNC study, those athletes coming in with an ACL injury, could we protect them through their tenure? And basically we found there was 100% reduction in contact ACL reoccurrence and an 80% reduction in non-contact. And the reason that's so important is because once you sustain an ACL, your risk of arthritis, early arthritis, is very high. Within 6 to 10 years, we start seeing some radiographic changes of the knee. And if you think, most of our athletes are sustaining these injuries earlier and earlier in life. You know, I have two girls I'm treating right now that are on the same ECNL team. They're 13. So if we're seeing radiographic changes, that places the Plumlee at 20 years old, where we're going to start seeing arthritic changes in their joints. And that's unacceptable to me. Clinically, it's unacceptable to me as a human. Like, we just need to do better. Next slide. So basically, FIFA was very interested in what we were doing here domestically. They had called in and basically said, what can we do globally? If you're having those kind of astounding, amazing results domestically, what can we do to the game and really help all of the confederations globally? So we teamed up as a group, met in Oslo back in 2005, and we revamped the program and not only made it ACL prevention specific, we kind of cast a wide net. We're like, how can we prevent all soccer related injury? So obviously that's impossible, but can we mitigate risk? Can we mitigate all soccer related risk? Next slide. So we did this first study in Oslo in Norwegian women, girls soccer players between the ages of 13 to 17. And this is the 11 plus program. Again, these programs are free. They're dynamic warm-ups. They plug in. They're only literally 35 to 40 minute commitment per week. And the results are so wonderful. 32% reduction in all injuries. Next. We had a 53% reduction in overuse injury and a 45% reduction in severity. So what that means is, like, not only are your athletes not getting injured as much in general, they're also, the injuries that they're incurring are much more benign. So they come back quicker. And so when you look long-term throughout the longevity of the season, is that, okay, if they do have a small isolated injury, they're going to be back. They're going to be available later on in the season, mid-season for you. Next slide. So we wanted to see, does the 11 plus program decrease the rate of ACL in male soccer players? Next slide. Because that first study was done in women. Next, we could just kind of click through. And we said, yes, there was a total ACL reduction in men's Division I and Division II soccer by 76%. And remember, this program was not designed to be ACL specific. This was designed to mitigate everything. So there's a lot of upside to the 11 plus. Next slide. Here's, if there's anything I say, this is one of the most important things. Does compliance impact time loss? Because one of the most perplexing things to me as a parent and as a clinician, as a PT, as a biomechanist is, why isn't everyone using this? Why do we not have better buy-in? And what we find, the more you use the program, basically the lower injury rate and the lower time loss due to injury. So basically the magic number is 2 times per week. You have to do it twice per week. If you do, you will reap the benefit of lower injury rate, lower severity injury. Also, you'll win more. Your winning percentage will increase. Now, I'm not saying we're making better soccer athletes per se. I'm saying we're making them more available to you. So your star striker will not be out with an ACL injury. You'll have them available to you late in season or postseason. Next slide. And this has been corroborated over and over and over again, like the work we did in the NCAA, Katarina Stefan's work in Norway and Canada. Next slide. So basically they followed 266 players. Basically the high adherence group, the group that did the 11 plus more frequently, not only won more and was injured less, but they had significant improvements in their functional balance and decreased injury rate. So another trophy or another win for adherence and compliance. Next slide. So why is compliance so challenging? And that's my charge to you. I still struggle to understand how we can make it easier for coaches. What can we do scientifically to help you implement this? Next slide. I understand we obviously identify risk, and then we create these interventions based on the science that we have from the video analysis and the data, all the epidemiology, and we determine these efficacies, but we need to implement better. And that's our charge to you. And how can we assist you in implementing it into your respective clubs? So our future directions, obviously, we're always revamping. We're always analyzing new data if ACL risk can be detected in pre-testing, and that remains to be seen. I personally think, yes, there are some differing opinions. I'd love to hear Niru's opinion on this. I think the screening tools in their current state aren't necessarily specific enough, but we do our best. Next slide. We want to refine the existing injury prevention programs in their current form, just keep making them better based on new data, and then be mindful of the brain. So interpreting information, remember, it's a defensive injury. And this is true for the NFL, for the NBA, for volleyball. It's predicting movement. So we want to be mindful of that. And then also, obviously, providing equal resources to female athletes to mitigate risk. We don't want this to be a resource issue. Next slide. So again, very quick, here are my contact information. Please reach out to me. I'm always happy to be a resource to all of you. I thank you all for coming on, and I will turn the floor back over to Dr. Champ.
Thanks, Holly, so much. I think a few quick points before we move on to the next. If you're in a youth club, if you have an organization, please be compliant, incorporate it into what you do twice a week. For 40 minutes total a week. And if you think about it, it's not just about ACL, it's about core strengthening, it's about balance, it's about strength in your core that mitigates risk in the lower extremities, overuse injuries, ACL prevention, other soft tissue injuries. So without question, probably one of the most important things you do as a club, as a coach, as an organization. Thanks, Holly, so much.